6:44 in Trinidad and Tobago. Before moving to our next interview, I omitted to mention yesterday that over the weekend we got information from the University of the West Indies that it is now in the top 1.5% of universities in the world. This is from the Times Higher Education Ranking System. And you know, someone will say, well, so what kind of thing? You know, if UE was down 94 points, we would be all up in arms. So it's something to point out that University of the West Indies, under the guidance of Hilary Beckles, UE Vice Chancellor, and so on, and indeed all those who would have preceded him, need to take immense credit for this. That the UE has moved up 94 places and is now in the top 1.5%, up from 3% last year in tertiary educational institutions in the world. That's a very commendable achievement. Congrats to all those associated with UE or Caribbean University. Well, let's keep our focus on the upcoming budget and the stakeholder meeting on workplace vaccinations. In today's Express, the CEO of AMCHAM, the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago, Nirad Tiwari, said the meeting was productive and everyone present agreed that vaccination is the best way to protect lives and livelihoods. Vaccinations and the COVID-19 impact will play a critical role in the recovery of the economy. How optimistic is AMCHAM about the upcoming presentation by the Finance Minister on Monday afternoon? Do they have a perspective on the safe zone operations outlined for businesses by the Prime Minister last Thursday? Well, Nirad Tiwari joins us now, CEO of AMCHAM. Nirad, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, good morning, Fazir. Good morning to everyone in studio and, of course, all your viewers. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you with us. All right. So, quite a few issues to discuss in just a few minutes' time. Your perspective on vaccination, well, not your perspective, in the sense, where do you see this thing going as far as implementation of a vaccination in the workplace policy based on yesterday's dialogue? Because it's all well and good to have dialogue, but are you confident that this is going to translate into implementation?
Well, I think what we established yesterday is that there is work that was done by the Multipartite Industrial Relations Advisory Committee, which includes representatives of business, academia, labor, and the government, that speaks to a risk-based approach to determining whether vaccinations are or should be a requirement in certain aspects of worksite. So you could have a company, for example, where certain parts of the establishment are at higher risk of transmission of the virus, and therefore you need to vaccinate or ensure that customers and staff in that part of the establishment are vaccinated. And so I think that was established, and that policy framework is now before the government, and there was a commitment to look at that. What was also interesting yesterday is that the OSH agency was present, and Ms. Sancho, the head of that agency, undertook to assess individual companies' risk assessments, so that if a company does a risk assessment and they deem that, as I said, certain parts of the entire business, it operates in such a way that there's a high risk of transmission of the virus and so on, then it may be reasonable to implement a policy to protect the workers, customers, and anyone who comes into contact with them or passes through the business. And so that, though, must be on the basis of risk, and the OSH agency has said that they would review companies' risk assessments to ensure that it meets the criteria and so on. And so that would be helpful and hopefully give comfort to all parties that any such move would be based on the science and based on a reasonable risk assessment. And so Minister Robinson Regis, as the chair of the meeting, undertook to go back to the Prime Minister with the concerns, and in the ministry's release, and to get a policy in place soon. There wasn't a definitive timeline, but I think there was a commitment to do it sooner rather than later.
Your hesitation and then saying soon says a lot as far as your own anticipation of the situation, Nira Tiwari. But we're going to get to the budget anticipation in a moment. But there are to be safe zones, from, if we are to believe what the Prime Minister said last Thursday, safe zones in less than 2 weeks' time. Businesses can't just shut down and stay closed until there's a government policy. Would it be correct to say that private sector has already moved on and essentially has a vaccination policy that may not be mandatory in black and white, but is almost mandatory in practice because the requirements are such that if people want to work and earn a living, they have to be vaccinated to work in certain places in the private sector. So the private sector would appear, Nira Tiwari, to have already moved on with that policy.
Well, I don't think that is completely accurate. So the safe zones will place a legal burden on the businesses to operate in a certain manner, and therefore those businesses, restaurants, bars, casinos, and so on, they will have to comply, and people who work there, people who consume those services, will have to be vaccinated because the business will not be allowed to operate otherwise. There are many other businesses that are open that do not have mandatory vaccination policies. And these are some of the things that we're working through. I mean, my entire family is vaccinated, my parents, my in-laws, my kids, myself, my wife. And we really believe that vaccination, the science is showing that vaccination is the best way to curb the spread of the virus and certainly the severity. And with Delta in the communities now, the health system could easily become overwhelmed again. And if that happens, we're going to have further restrictions. We can't go to the beach right now. We can't do many of the things that we would like to do. And the best way to curb the severity of the disease is through vaccination. We are in a very fortunate position in Trinidad and Tobago where we have vaccine choice. Many of us earlier in the year were calling on the government to act with alacrity to get access to vaccines. They have. We are in a lucky position as a country where you can get Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Sinopharm. And so you have a choice not just of vaccines, but technology, because some people don't like one type or the other. Some people can't take one type or the other. And therefore, we really urge people to go out and get vaccinated so that we can all get back to the lives that we would like to have. And in the meantime, really, the vaccinated are paying for the unvaccinated because we feel a sense of duty, those of us who have gotten vaccinated, not just to ourselves, but to other people, because we know that the likelihood of us getting sick once vaccinated is very low, but the likelihood we can still spread it. And therefore, if we spread it to someone who is not vaccinated, or if it spreads through somebody else, the likelihood of them getting sick is quite high. And so right now we are really curbing our restrictions for the unvaccinated.
And Nira Tiwari, while we wait for the grand perspective from the Prime Minister, because it's been taken out to the Prime Minister for his final determination, did you get a sense of a willingness to collaborate, especially with the with the trade union movement in relation to yesterday's dialogue? Is this going to be caught up in confrontation, for want of a better term?
So I have found that the union movement, while they have some concerns and are somewhat hesitant because we are operating, quite frankly, in a situation of fairly low trust, I have found the union leaders to be open and engaging. And we, the private sector, us, the T&T Chamber, the Energy Chamber, and the TTMA, have been engaging the major trade union federations, the FITA and the NATOC and the JTUM, through the Cipriani or facilitated by the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies over some time. And we have found that, one, there is an absolute commitment to the national interest by all of us, and people are willing to engage, to listen, and to try and get to solutions. So I'm optimistic that we are all generally on the same page, and there are some I's to dot and T's to cross to make sure that whatever is done does not affect other things that people hold sacrosanct, such as the rights to collective bargaining and consultation, collective bargaining in unionized environments, I should stress, and consultation writ large. And those are reasonable principles, and so I'm optimistic that we'll get to some solutions.
And before we reach the top of the hour, Neeraj Tiwari, your perspectives, your sense of anticipation in relation to the budget presentation, which is due on Monday afternoon of next week?
So, I mean, if you look at what's happening now with commodity prices and oil and gas prices, it should put us in a better position from a revenue perspective. And when I say better position, I don't just mean income earning. I mean income earning that will give us some space to do some transformative things. So I would really, really like to see some of the recommendations of AMCHAM and the other organizations implemented. I mean, basic things like the National Statistical Institute, some of the digital transformation things such as electronic funds transfer, all those pieces of legislation implemented so that you could pay online, not just for government services, but more generally for all services, adoption of electronic signatures, the unique national identification number, open data, government interoperability framework. And then we propose some more novel things. I mean, so we have proposed an accountability council, not unlike the Jamaican EPOC, where they would monitor the targets set by the government, report periodically to the population on progress, and of course then ultimately assess whether we've been successful. We are proposing a national recovery fund that can mobilize private capital without increasing the debt burden, and that could be offset by future tax breaks. So the things that we are proposing are not very specific to businesses or individual sectors, but hopefully are more transformative and help with the ease of doing business. So we're optimistic that some of these things will be heeded, and what we will see in the budget is less of an accounting exercise and more of a framework for growth moving forward.
Okay, so let's just say, Neeraj Tiwari, that the finance minister would say, okay, let me just take this AMCHAM Trinidad and Tobago proposal in its entirety, cut and paste and put it in the budget and read it out one time. Would that give you confidence that it will actually be implemented?
Well, you know, Fazir, it would be unfair and impossible to be pessimistic all the time. It would also be unreasonable given...
Could I interrupt you here for 30 seconds, Neeraj Tiwari? You say being pessimistic, but what do you base your optimism on if we're talking about implementation of budget presentations?
So I was, the second part of what I was about to say is that it would also be foolhardy to believe that everything that is said will be implemented. And so we have to find ways to work together. We've had some recent successes, I think, in terms of the way we'll get stuff done is if we work together and in a spirit of collaboration. When the private sector and NGOs got together and helped with the vaccination drive, that was an excellent example, we think, of public-private partnership. The ministry set the policy, made the vaccines available, did the oversight, and we implemented and executed. I mean, in our site with the T&T Chamber and the Coalition of Services, we did 33,000 jobs in 36 working days. I think that's pretty good. So especially when you consider that the country is now doing about 1,500 jobs a day. Now we were doing almost that a day. So I think that in that one site. So we've had discussions with the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and Minister Bacchus is very, very open, and we're actually going to the T&T Chamber and AMCHAM T&T are going to help to input some of the data on forms from those vaccination exercises, not from our site is up to date, but from other sites where the data hasn't been entered. That will help with the digital vaccination certificate and therefore help with the implementation of the safe zones So there's good collaboration there, and that's through the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Digital Transformation. I thought yesterday's meeting went very, very well. Minister Robinson Regis really facilitated a fairly open discussion, and people were able to express their views freely, and I think in a spirit of trying to get to solutions. So hopefully you see more of this happening, and we focus on the objective and see how we can each contribute to making that happen. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, but you can't sit back when something is announced and say, well, it's not going to happen, I'm not going to try anyway. So we're going to continue plugging away and seeing how best we can contribute.
Neerad Tiwari, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to be with us this morning. We really appreciate you making the effort. Thank you very much once again.
My pleasure, Fazir, always. Thank you.
Neerad Tiwari, who is, of course, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of AMCHAM. And as we get to the top of the hour, in our first hour, discussing all of these issues. And indeed, once again, we should have had this dialogue months ago and had a clear policy in place and let the various stakeholders have their debates and argue and so on months ago. But here we are again, late in the game. But some will say, trying to be optimistic, better late than never. But we're on time at least for the news.
Good morning.